Hello and welcome back to The Perch from the Wyoming Tribune Eagle. I'm Noah Zahn, your local government reporter here. This week, we're sharing a conversation that I had with our state government reporter, Hannah Shields. She's been at the Wyoming State Capitol building for much of the past 2 months, covering this year's legislative session. This year's session may have received more national attention than in years past after Wyoming voters supported candidates representing the Wyoming Freedom Caucus, which is a group of hardline Republicans. This caucus has been in the state for a few years now and is present in other states across the country as well. However, this is the first time ever in the nation that a Freedom Caucus gained a majority control of a legislative branch. In Wyoming, they got majority control of the House of Representatives. Next week on The Perch, we'll be sharing a conversation that we had with Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon on some of his thoughts coming out of this year's legislative session. But first, here's Hannah. All right, now I'm here with Hannah Shields, our state government reporter. You're back in the office. You haven't been here in the past month or two. I guess you've been
2 months.
2 months you've been out at the Capitol most of the time. You've been covering the legislative session, which wrapped up last week on Thursday. And now we're here to chat about what the work you've been doing over there. So I guess just first of all, can you just tell me how those final few days were and coming out of that, what that's been like and what people were saying at the end of it?
So the final few days, and all I can think about is like back to the budget session last year. The ending of the budget session last year and the ending of the general session this year felt very, very different because I remember last year, it was the last day of the session. Journalists didn't know if the legislature was going to pass the biennium budget or if we were going to go into a special session. And it was just, I don't know, very climatic. But this year, because the Senate announced that they were not going to pass the supplemental budget 2 weeks ago, things just kind of fizzled out. And it was very anticlimactic. And I mean, last day of the session, I actually had no more bills to write about just because it was either being covered by another journalist or the bill died. So it was interesting. It was kind of just like this weird ghost town vibe. But yeah, still definitely some things to note coming out of this session for sure.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me a little bit about the, I guess, the efficiency this year? What did they bring forth and what did they pass? How much was there that didn't make it?
Yeah, the Legislative Service Office posted a report of the total amount of bills that were introduced this session. So combining both the House and the Senate, 556 bills were filed for introduction. Out of those 556, 178 were passed by the legislature. So that counts for about 32% of total legislation. There was a high number of bills considered. A lot of them were individually sponsored, meaning a lawmaker sponsored their own bill. Usually that is accompanied by other lawmakers signed on as co-sponsors. Or you also have committee bills. And these are bills that come out of the interim, also known as the legislature's off-season. And committee bills, those are the result of hours of public testimony, research, interviewing experts, addressing Wyoming problems, and coming up with solutions to those problems. And then the legislative committee will sponsor the bill to be considered this session. So, I mean, last year was an anomaly where because it was a budget session, you needed a 2/3 vote to get a non-budget bill introduced into the session. And Wildfire reported on this, but a record number of committee bills failed to pass that 2/3 introduction because the Wyoming Freedom Caucus at the time and the House didn't have like a full 2/3 to pass, but they did have enough people to block bills from getting introduced. This year, it wasn't that simple, it wasn't like that. It was a lot easier to get bills in. The House Speaker, Senate President just had to introduce it. But still, Representative Lloyd Larson was telling me earlier this week that typically around 20% of committee bills fail to make it into law. But according to the stats from the Legislative Service Office, just under half of the committee bills made it to the governor's desk, so 47%, meaning that more than 50% of committee bills failed to make it through the finish line compared to that 20% that Larson was telling me about.
And I think you touched on it a little bit, but one of the more interesting things about this session and the reason that it received a lot of national attention for, even though Wyoming is the least populated state in the country, but it was the first state to have a Freedom Caucus majority in a legislative branch. So can you just tell me about that and how things felt different this year, maybe what that looked like?
Yeah. So the Freedom Caucus, which is a group of hardline Republicans, won control of the House of Representatives or the lower chamber in the Wyoming Legislature. And that was the news that grabbed the nation's attention. New York Times wrote about it. So it was kind of interesting to see how things were going to go through this year. Friday morning, the day after the session ended, the Wyoming Freedom Caucus had one last press conference with members of the media, where, of course, they spoke to a lot of the legislation that did pass that they had prioritized. A lot of their five and dime bills made it through, except for an anti-DEI bill that was vetoed by the governor. But a lot of these bills did make it through the legislature and over to the governor's desk. At the same time, I did ask the House Speaker and Freedom Caucus member, Representative Chip Nyman, about the committee bills. Because this was a story that we had done earlier this week about the lack of committee bills that made it through. For example, all of the affordable housing bills died this session. All of the gaming bills, a majority of which were committee bills, also died this session. So I asked him what his approach was, because as the House Speaker, he has the power to pull bills out of his drawer for introduction. And then the House Majority Floor Leader has the power to decide in what order those bills are heard on the floor. So speaking with both of them, they told me they wanted to, first of all, so Representative Scott Heiner is our Majority Floor Leader in the House, and what he was telling me was that a lot of these committee bills came out of the interim in the 67th legislature. So these were, when these bills went through the vetting process by former members of the legislature that are no longer here. And so what he was telling me is that, these were not vetted by the new members. And he really wanted to focus on bills that were important to the body as it currently stands. What Representative Nyman told me was that the way he approached these bills was whether or not they addressed the front burner concerns of Wyoming people today. Not Wyoming people 2 years ago, but the Wyoming people today who elected the Freedom Caucus. So that was just kind of their answer on why, some of these committee bills didn't see it all the way through. And they still said, a lot of committee bills still made it through the House, which is true. But just overall, a lot of these bills did not make it through. So, yeah, I also spoke with Representative Landon Brown about this as well. And one of the things I asked him was judging the amount of committee bills that failed to pass this year, do you see this same trend happening in the budget session? And what he told me is, because we now have the 68th legislature, that means we have these new members stacked in these committees who are going to be hearing these meetings and drafting these bills. So that could mean that committee bills might stand a better chance next year, especially with a lot of these committees stacked with members of the Freedom Caucus.
Mm-hmm. And this year, before the session, you and Carrie Hatterley, who helped us out with coverage during the session, worked on a story outlining some of the key legislative topics that you'll be following throughout the session. So I was curious if you could walk through some of that. You've already talked about some of those, but those items in that story you outlined were education funding and school policy, property tax relief measures, affordable housing, election policies, and gaming legislation. So I'm curious if you could brief me on how bills regarding those topics went.
Yeah, definitely. So I can start with education funding and the school policy. Education funding, largely what I was referring to there, was the cost adjustment to the K-12 school block grant, which the legislature funds every year. Now, this funding, also known as the ECA funding for public schools, is tied to the supplemental budget. So when the supplemental budget was nixed by the Senate, that funding was temporarily lost. And then Senate Majority Floor Leader Tara Nethercott, who's a Republican here from Cheyenne, she made a motion to amend one of the bills and reinsert that funding amount. Originally, at the very beginning of the session, appropriators cut that funding down to $48.8 million from the original $66.3, which was told by legislative experts this is what would get the state back onto fully funding its public schools. So after that money was cut down in the original supplemental budget was gone. So Senator Nethercott, she made an amendment to not only restore that funding, but restore it to the full $66.3 million. And one thing to note about that is just a few days before, a U.S. District Court judge ruled in favor of a lawsuit against the state that claimed the state was unconstitutionally underfunding its public schools. This was something that Nethercott kind of mentioned on the Senate floor when she was bringing this amendment forward, when she said something along the lines of, we just received some information that maybe we should be fully funding our schools. Mm-hmm. So, that full funding was put back in there. It passed through the House, and now that's on the way to the governor's desk. So I think one really great positive thing coming out of the session is, the legislature passed a full funding of its public schools. And because Governor Gordon had originally recommended that full funding in his supplemental budget request, I think it's very likely that he will sign off on that. So that's something good news for our schools. However, also part of the supplemental budget was $4 million for child development centers, which are preschool programs for kids with special needs. These centers have long told lawmakers, that they're struggling on how much funding they're getting from the state right now and that they need more and that they're in danger of closing their doors. So out of the original $8 million request from the Department of Health, legislators ended up granting about $4 million in the supplemental budget. However, after the supplemental budget was gone, the funding for the child development centers was gone as well. Now, lawmakers in both the Senate and the House tried to restore that funding again through an amendment to a bill. However, those amendments did fail. So our child development centers will not be seeing any money from the state this year. So also in terms of education funding, lawmakers passed and Gordon signed on the Steamboat Legacy Scholarship Act, which is a universal school voucher program in Wyoming. Basically what it does, it expands the state's current education savings account program, which uses state funds to send kids to a private school. And it can also be used for homeschools as well. So this was passed. Part of the controversy behind this bill is the constitutional concerns raised by several lawmakers who voted against it. Because essentially what this bill does is it allows anybody in Wyoming to apply for state money to send their kids to a private school. Last year, when a similar bill was up before the governor, he did add a family-based income requirement so that only families at or below 150% of the federal poverty level would could qualify for this program. That was taken out, and Gordon still signed on it anyways, praising it as a remarkable piece of legislation. The only exception to that is the Senate did manage to put back in the pre-kindergarten eligibility, so families can use these funds to send their kids to a preschool, but that does have a means testing, so they have to be at or below 250% of the federal poverty level to apply for those funds. Outside of that, there were a couple of other school policy bills, one being a ban on cell phone use. That one did not make it through. An enhanced concealed carry permit to allow special certified concealed carry holders to bring their guns onto campus. That also did not make it through. However, the Wyoming Gun-Free Zones Repeal Act, which repeals most gun-free zones in the state, did go through. Gordon let it go into law without his signature, saying that was still a legislative power grab. He still had gripes with this legislation as he did in the previous year when a similar bill came up, but he vetoed it. This year, he let it come into law. But basically, what this bill does is it lifts gun-free zones in most places. So, for example, people can now conceal carry in governmental and legislative meetings under this bill. They can bring concealed carry into public school campuses under this bill. And they can also even bring it into airports where concealed carry is not prohibited under federal law.
And Gordon vetoed a similar bill last year, but chose not to do so this year. Was that just because he thought that his veto would be overturned?
I think that could be it.
Okay.
That's what I'm assuming, because we did see a lot of his veto overrides happen this year. For example, there were 2 bills related to abortion access. One requiring Wyoming's only surgical abortion center to get licensed as a surgical ambulatory center. That bill made it to Gordon's desk, but he vetoed it. And then that veto was overridden by lawmakers. Same thing with another anti-abortion bill that would be actually Representative Nyman's ultrasound bill, meaning women need to get an ultrasound, or more specifically, a transvaginal ultrasound, and then wait 48 hours before taking an abortion pill. That was another bill that Gordon had vetoed. And again, it went back to the legislature and lawmakers overrode his veto. So I'm assuming maybe that was his line of thinking with the Gun-Free Zones Act, but he didn't specifically say.
Sure. We had a 2-part series on the perch discussing Senate File 44, which regarded trans athletes in collegiate sports. What did that bill look like making its way through the governing body?
Yeah, so there were 2 bills related to transgender athletes. Representative Martha Lawley had a bill that would basically ban transgender participation on female-only sports in grades K through 12, as well as colleges. And then Senator Wendy Schuler had her own transgender athletes bill, but it limited it to just college sports. So what ended up happening, both of those bills were heard in the opposite chambers committee. So, for example, the Senate bill was heard in a House committee, and the House bill was heard in a Senate committee. The House bill was heard first, and senators had issues with Lawley's bill. They just didn't think it was a strong piece of legislation. So they held it back to maybe discuss the next day, because that was the last day to get those bills out of committee. So they kind of held it back. They wanted to see what happened with Senator Schuler's bill first. Senator Schuler's bill was heard a couple hours later in the House committee. That one ended up passing through. People liked that bill more. They just thought it was like better written and more sound in structure. And so that bill ended up passing through all the way through the legislature and is still waiting for Gordon's signature or veto, or it could even go into law without Gordon's signature. So we have yet to see what happens on that bill. But it was amended, though, to include something from Lawley's bill. And the biggest amendment there was these female-only college sports cannot play against another team that might have a transgender player. So that provision from Lawley's bill ended up going into Schuler's bill, and now it's sitting on governor's desk.
And I think the last thing I want to ask you about is just how things felt at the end of the session. I know that Gordon addressed the House of Representatives, which you covered in your story that came out last weekend on that. Just leaving the session, how did things feel?
Leaving the session, I just speaking with a few of the representatives in the House, I could sense some frustration, I think, on the floor. One of the things that I noticed early on as a reporter, just sitting up in the gallery watching these debates, was that almost like within the first 5 votes, you could tell whether an amendment was going to pass or fail to a bill, just based on how many people were voting for it. I mean, it was the first year that the Wyoming Freedom Caucus had control of the House.
Well, I mean, that's about it. Was there anything else that you wanted to add about your coverage of this session?
Yeah, it was long. It was long. It was tiring. I mean, I think I was definitely surprised to see the supplemental budget not get through. I was not expecting that. I was thinking maybe because both the Senate and the House seemed very firm on their positions on certain things within the budget. And I was thinking, well, if anything, we'll go into a special session to figure this out, or they'll use the extra 3 days to figure this out. I was not expecting the Senate to drop a bomb and say, we're actually just not going to pass it at all this year. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of unexpected.
And what will that look like, for most Wyoming residents, not having that supplemental budget passed? What will that mean for them?
So it means funding that had been secured for different agencies and programs was lost with the budget. One caveat to that is lawmakers did try to take a lot of the funding that was in that budget bill and just put it in different bills as amendments. But there were arguments on the floor about whether or not those amendments were germane, or in other words, related to the bill, because you can't just add random amendments to a bill that has nothing to do with the topic. So that was what happened with the Child Development Center funding. Senate Vice President Tim Salazar, who has long advocated for this funding, said, I really want to put this in there, but I can't because it has nothing to do with this bill, and he voted against it. So one of the stories that I'm going to be following up on after the session is, what happened to these agencies who lost the funding? How, desperately did they need it? Does this disrupt things in any way? And just kind of going down that line. So that's definitely one of the things I want to be working on after the session.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Hannah. I appreciate you coming back into the office and having this conversation with me, and we'll look forward to the follow-up stories that you're working on.
Yeah, of course. We have new flavors of Oreos in the office now. Very exciting.
Yeah, you missed a lot.
I did miss a lot.
Yeah. And now I'm here with Taylor Staples, our arts and entertainment reporter, to bring us a roundup of some of the events coming up this week.
Yeah, so the events happening today are the Laramie County Sportsman Expo. Today it kicks off, and it's happening today, tomorrow, and Sunday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. at the Event Center at Archer. And then from noon to 1, people can join Maestro William and Shirley Gator at the library for a lunch and learn ahead of the American Escapades concert tomorrow night. And the Shine Little Theater Players production of Steel Magnolias also kicks off tonight at 7:30 p.m. The play will also have times tomorrow at 6 and 7:30, and a 2 p.m. matinee will be performed on Sunday. All shows are at the Historic Atlas Theater. On Saturday, March 15th, the opening of the Seed Library at the Laramie County Library is from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., and there will also be a houseplant sale at the Cheyenne Botanic Gardens from 10 to 1. Also, Cats and Coffee Connections will have a Plants and Cats event from 6 to 7:30 p.m., and the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra American Escapades concert will be at 7:30 p.m. at the Cheyenne Civic Center. Then, on Sunday, March 16th, Cats and Coffee Connections is hosting a diamond painting party with Shamrocks from 1 to 3. On Monday, March 17th, the library will host a Cat in the Hat event from 4 to 5, and the University of Wyoming Extension will hold a 4-H Career Night Zoom at 6 p.m. aimed at junior and high school students in Wyoming. On Tuesday, March 18th, the library will host a Teen Art of Creativity Club from 4 to 5, as well as a Tween Tasters Chippin' and Dippin' event from 6 to 7 p.m. Also, the Cheyenne Audubon Society is hosting a program about restoring bald eagles at Channel Islands National Park at 6:30 p.m. at the library. Then, on Wednesday, March 19th, the library is having a chair yoga and poetry session from 11 to 11:40 a.m., as well as a Library for All event for adults with disabilities from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. Also, the Cheyenne Creativity Center will have an open studio session from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. East High School also has their first day for their spring musical, Rock of Ages, at 7 p.m., and the Black Jacket Symphony will perform the Beatles' Abbey Road at the Cheyenne Civic Center at 8 p.m. And finally, on Thursday, March 20th, the library is holding a mental health services information session from noon to 1. Whispering Chase has a Dine and Discover cheesecake sampling event at 2 p.m., and kids can also sit and read to a therapy dog at the library from 4 to 5. Also, the Lincoln Way Event Hall is holding Thankful Thursdays again at 4 p.m. This week's nonprofit is the Cheyenne Greenway Foundation.
Great. Thank you, Taylor. Appreciate that. And before we wrap up this week's episode, here's a quick recap of some of our top stories and headlines from this past week. More than a dozen people from Veterans of Foreign Wars post-1881 and disabled American veterans gathered in Judge Stephen Sharp's courtroom Monday as their former treasurer pleaded not guilty to 2 charges of felony theft and a charge of forgery. Cheryl K. Shannon is accused of stealing roughly $30,000 from the VFW Post's auxiliary and $38,560 from the DAV. She was arrested in December, waived her right to a preliminary hearing, and pleaded not guilty to all charges in Laramie County District Court. In December, the Cheyenne City Council voted to implement a paid parking program in downtown Cheyenne slated to begin this summer. On Monday, they reversed that decision after downtown business owners and property owners overwhelmingly opposed the plan. Now, parking will primarily remain the way that it currently is downtown. And finally, Cheyenne Frontier Days officially announced their concert lineups for this year's shows. The 2025 lineup includes the likes of Wyoming's Ian Munsick, Brooks and Dunn, Luke Bryan, and Megan Maroney, with one more performer still to be announced. That's all for this week's episode of The Perch. Hope you enjoyed, and be sure to tune back in next week where we'll be sharing a conversation with Governor Mark Gordon about some of his thoughts coming out of this year's Wyoming legislative session.